So what sort of games did you build using the C64, and what was your involvement there? Like, were you part of a broader group, sharing your games and kind of shopping them around?
Well, we did three games in the 80s on C64. We started with the America's Cup sailing simulation, and we did two other games which are sort of fantasy role-playing action kind of games. We did them all for a publisher called Electronic Arts, who in those days was a tiny little publisher, not the big giant they are today. And piracy was always a little bit of an issue. Of course, in those days we had a very physical solution, which was to supply one of those dodgy code wheels where you had to kind of match up different things in the hope that people would not be able to use the games illegally. But of course everyone just photocopied the manuals, and it was just an extra thing people sent around. But that was all kind of in the spirit of nothing much has changed. It's all you have the proportion of those people that are going to pirate things and swap them around, and they always get a certain proportion of retail sales. So I don't think those things have really changed, just the format has changed a bit.
Sure.
So what were kind of the RPGs you did?
So we did one called Stalkers, which was more like an action, a little bit of RPG, but mainly running around shooting stuff, which was inspired by a coin-op game at the time called Gauntlet. So we sort of proposed that to our publisher, and they thought it was a very good idea because it was a very successful game at the time. And again, we managed to exploit a few things in the Commodore 64, which only really allowed you to have 8 sprites or 8 sort of moving things around the screen at any one time. And so we did a few tricks to be able to fiddle with the hardware to give the illusion of a lot more than that. So we were kind of pleased with the result of that as well.
Do you have any of those kicking around online as examples?
I think pretty much the Commodore 64 underground scene is archived, I'm sure, for posterity, almost everything. Prosperity for almost everything to do with Commodore 64. So I'm sure if you hunt around, you can find one. I certainly found some YouTube videos of it recently, of people who played it recently or recorded it recently at least.
Do you find there's a new generation of gamers now who are interested in the sorts of things that you were making in the 80s?
I think there is, for a number of different reasons. I think one of them is somehow the Commodore 64 sound had a bit of a cult following. Just the synthesizer, the nature of that chip and what it could produce. A lot of people just thought those sounds had instant memories of that era, and so that was a lot of the appeal in going back to those things. But in those days, it was a lot more about, because the machines were so limited, it was a lot more about sort of, one would argue the purity of the gameplay. And so I think, a lot these days, because you've got so many high production values, and the hardware is so powerful that you spend a lot of time and money just trying to sort of push those limits, and then taking risks on gameplay and other things sort of falls into a smaller category. So I think for that reason, it's sort of always been a bit of a favourite, and maybe that's why there's a bit of a revival. Also because whilst the high end of town on PS3s and those things are pushing that side of things, we also have iPhones and web games and Facebook games, so sort of other formats are coming into a wider population which support simpler style games through Flash and other medium like that, which are very resource sort of heavy in terms of sort of the programming environment, so you can't do quite as much, but it means you can still have a market for making these smaller games which sort of overlap with what we had to deal with in the 80s. So it's kind of a nice little a loop back on those times, I think.
So you think it's a renaissance of the smaller game developer as these new platforms emerge?
I think it is, and I think there's a lot of sort of almost like a bit of relief that there's a medium for exploring all those things, which we don't have to spend $20 million on a huge production to try and compete with hundreds and thousands and millions of dollars worth of sales and millions of copies worth of sales, but we can do something small for a small budget that explores a new idea, and it might work and it might not, but it's not going to cost the earth, and we might be able to make a bit of money from it if it does take off. And that's sort of where innovation it's really born, so it's kind of exciting to see that those sort of mediums have kind of come full circle and are letting those things come back again.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
You're welcome.